I found out he cheated. I didn't scream or beg. I ruined the one thing he cared about. I knew something was off the moment I pulled the crumpled receipt from the dryer, though at first it didn't look like much. Just a small square of paper, wrinkled and warm, tucked against the damp edge of a sweatshirt I'd forgotten to fold. But it was the name of the restaurant that made my stomach twist. Ember and Ash. A place you have to book weeks in advance. The kind of modern goth steakhouse with black candles on every table and a menu that reads more like a riddle than dinner. It wasn't a spot we ever went together. I stared at the faint purple ink, the date circling in my mind before I even registered it. 3 nights ago. My name wasn't on the reservation. Instead, there were 2 entrees, 2 cocktails, 1 dessert, and a note scribbled on the back by a server. Come back soon. You two look perfect together. Perfect. I stood there in the laundry room with the hum of the dryer filling the silence and felt my pulse climb into my throat. It would have been easy to storm into the living room right then, to fling the receipt at him like a weapon and demand answers. But something heavier kept my feet planted. Maybe it was shock. Maybe it was the quiet dread that once the words left my mouth, there would be no undoing them. Instead, I slid the receipt into the pocket of my jeans and folded the rest of the clothes with mechanical precision. The air smelled like fabric softener and betrayal. He was in the kitchen humming to some indie playlist, completely unaware that the little world we'd built over 5 years had just cracked along an invisible seam. I walked out and kissed him on the cheek, a reflex more than affection, and he smiled at me the way he always did, like nothing in the universe was out of place. That night, I lay awake long after he fell asleep, his breathing slow and steady against the pillow we'd shared since college. The glow of his phone screen tempted me from the nightstand, but I didn't touch it. Instead, I replayed every conversation we'd had that week, every small inconsistency I'd brushed aside, the late meeting, the sudden obsession with a new cologne, the way he'd laughed too hard at a text that buzzed during dinner. Each memory slotted into place like puzzle pieces forming an ugly picture. My mind churned with questions. Who was she? How long? Why wasn't I enough? But underneath the panic was a strange clarity. If I confronted him too soon, he'd deny it, spin a story, maybe even cry. I didn't want a performance. I wanted the truth to speak for itself. The next morning, I brewed coffee and acted like nothing had changed. He talked about a new project at work, about maybe hosting a small dinner for our friends on Friday to celebrate a promotion he was expecting. I nodded, smiling at all the right moments, even kissed him goodbye at the door. The second he left, I sat on the couch and stared at the receipt until the ink blurred. My hands itched to text someone, my sister, my best friend, anyone. But I held back. Telling people too soon would make it real, and I wasn't ready for real. Instead, I opened my laptop and started combing through our shared accounts. Bank statements, email confirmations, the cloud backup he never bothered to secure. Each click felt like peeling skin from a wound. By noon, I had screenshots of a private email chain and a photo of the two of them outside Ember and Ash, his hand resting casually on her back like it belonged there. My heart pounded, but my face remained eerily calm, as if detachment were the only way to survive. 3 days passed like this, me playing the part of the loving girlfriend while collecting silent proof of every lie. I cooked dinner, laughed at his stories, even watched the stupid true crime series we'd been binging. Each interaction felt like a scene in a play I no longer believed in. At night, I slept on the couch, claiming I'd fallen asleep during late-night work calls, and he barely questioned it. Maybe he thought distance was normal after 5 years. Maybe he was too busy planning his next secret dinner to notice the way my eyes followed his every move. By the third night, the weight of what I knew pressed so hard against my chest I could barely breathe. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just planned. When Friday finally arrived, he floated around the apartment with the energy of someone about to receive an award. He set the table with the fancy plates we only used on holidays, his hair neatly styled the way I'd always loved. Friends were scheduled to arrive at 7 for what he called a casual celebration. I agreed to pick up wine, intentionally choosing the cheapest bottle I could find. On the drive home, the city lights blurred into a haze, and for a moment I wondered if I was about to ruin not just his night, but the carefully curated life we built. Shared leases, joint savings, mutual friends who thought we were perfect. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, but underneath the fear there was a cold resolve. He had taken something from me I couldn't name. Tonight, I would take something back. The apartment was already humming with a quiet tension when I carried the bottles of bargain wine through the door. A tension only I could hear beneath the clatter of pots and the warm scent of rosemary butter that seeped through every room like a false promise. He stood at the counter in a crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow, his hair combed back with a precision that used to thrill me on nights we dressed up for each other. Yes, and he looked up with a boyish grin that might once have disarmed me, but now only sharpened the blade of my resolve. I set the wine down, my smile a careful mask, and let my eyes wander across the apartment we had filled together over half a decade. The framed photos of beach trips and holiday dinners, the chipped ceramic bowl we bought at a street fair, the bookshelf stacked with novels annotated in 2 different handwritings that once felt like proof of a shared life. Each object glimmered with memory and betrayal at the same time, and as he talked, about the herb crust on the roast, about the playlist he'd curated for the night, I heard nothing but the drum of my own heartbeat and the whisper of the plan I had built in silence over 3 long days. I had rehearsed every move, every breath, until the plan felt as natural as breathing, a choreography of quiet destruction that would unfold the moment the first guest crossed our threshold. But even with the steps memorized, a current of savage anticipation zipped beneath my skin, making my palms slick and my breath shallow. I thought of the screenshots hidden on a thumb drive in my purse, of the email already drafted on my phone, of the single envelope waiting in the bedroom, where it sat like a loaded weapon disguised as paper. And I felt the strange, exhilarating calm that comes when a storm is inevitable and you are the one steering it toward land. As I helped him set the table, I found myself studying his every gesture. How he adjusted a fork by a fraction of an inch, how he checked his reflection in the dark window pane when he thought I wasn't looking. And each small movement confirmed what I had already decided. This was not a man who had made a single mistake in a moment of weakness. This was a man who had built a second life with the same careful attention he used to arrange the napkins. While he poured me a glass of wine, I pictured the photo I discovered of him and the woman outside Ember and Ash, the way his hand rested possessively at the small of her back, and I felt my lips curve into a smile that must have looked loving, but was in fact the satisfied grin of a predator who knows the trap is already set. He asked if I was excited to see everyone, if I thought the roast would turn out, if the wine would be enough, and I answered each question with practiced warmth, careful not to betray the quiet thrill that pulsed beneath my ribs like a second heartbeat. When the buzzer finally rang announcing the first guest, I excused myself to the bedroom under the pretense of touching up my makeup, though what I really needed was a final glance at the envelope resting on the dresser. Inside were printed photographs, screenshots of emails, and a letter written in my neatest script, explaining exactly what he had done and to whom he had done it, each piece of evidence sealed and ready for the moment when I would slip it into the hands of every friend who entered our home. My fingers grazed the paper through the thin layer of the envelope, and a shiver of power ran through me, a physical jolt so strong it almost made me laugh out loud. I took a deep breath, steadied myself, and returned to the kitchen, where the doorbell chimed again and again, each ring another beat in the symphony of quiet vengeance I had composed. Guests began to filter in with the easy warmth of people who believed they were stepping into a celebration rather than the quiet implosion of a relationship, their laughter rising in soft bursts as coats were shrugged off and bottles of wine exchanged for hugs. I moved among them like a gracious host, my smile wide enough to hide the tremor in my jaw, while inside my mind every detail clicked into place like the tumblers of a lock. He greeted each arrival with the charm that had once undone me, handshakes, shoulder squeezes, a perfectly timed compliment for every outfit, and I watched him perform with the detached fascination of someone observing a snake uncoil in slow motion. I offered drinks, adjusted the music, and kept one eye on the small stack of envelopes I had arranged on the console table beneath the framed photograph of our first vacation together. Each envelope bore a guest's name in my careful handwriting, a tiny act of intimacy that would soon detonate the night. As conversations bloomed around me, I caught fragments of easy chatter, work promotions, weekend plans, the best way to roast potatoes, and each banal detail made the evidence in my purse feel heavier, more electric, as if the truth itself were a live wire buzzing against my thigh. At one point, my best friend leaned close to whisper how proud she was of us, how perfect we seemed. And the irony nearly stole the air from my lungs. I had to swallow hard to keep from laughing at the word perfect, the same word that had been scrawled on the back of the receipt that started it all. Across the room, he moved from group to group, topping off glasses and spinning stories about late nights at the office, his smile as polished as the cutlery he had laid out with surgical precision. And every time our eyes met, I felt a strange, almost scientific curiosity about how much a person could hide behind a single expression. I wondered whether he sensed the shift in the air, the faint static that hummed around me like the warning before a lightning strike, or whether he was too wrapped in his own performance to notice the quiet storm assembling in plain sight. When dinner was finally announced, I guided everyone toward the table, weaving through bodies and laughter, my heart beating a steady war drum against my ribs. The roast glistened under the overhead light, the rosemary filling the room with a warmth that mocked the chill crawling through my veins. And as I took my seat, I felt the envelope in my pocket press like a heartbeat against my skin. Toasts were made, glasses clinked, and I raised my wine with the rest of them, my lips shaping words of gratitude while my mind rehearsed the next step, the moment when dessert plates were cleared, and I would quietly ask each guest to retrieve the envelope waiting with their name. I pictured their faces as they unfolded the papers inside, the flicker of confusion giving way to shock, the awkward glance toward the man at the head of the table who would feel the weight of every eye upon him. He would try to explain, of course, his talent for improvisation was one of the reasons I had once loved him, but the photographs and emails left no room for denial, no space for tears or frantic apologies. As I listened to the murmur of conversation around me, I felt a fierce clarity settle over my mind, a cold, crystalline certainty that this night would end not in screams or broken dishes, but in the quiet, irreversible collapse of the carefully constructed life he had paraded before our friends. The dessert arrived, a chocolate torte rich enough to silence the table for a few blissful bites, and I used the lull to rise casually from my seat, excusing myself to fetch more wine. My legs carried me toward the console table with a steadiness that felt almost supernatural, each step echoing in my ears like the countdown to detonation. I lifted the first envelope, the one bearing my best friend's name, and for a heartbeat I considered the enormity of what I was about to do. Not just exposing a betrayal, but altering the trajectory of every relationship in this room, rewriting the story each person thought they knew about us. Then I thought of the photograph of him and her outside Ember and Ash, of the way his hand claimed her body as if mine did not exist, and the hesitation evaporated like breath on cold glass. I turned back to the table, the envelope light as ash in my hand, and caught his eye just as he reached for his wine. For the first time all evening, his smile faltered. A tiny fracture in the mask that told me he understood something had shifted, though he could not yet name the storm gathering in the silence between us. I felt the room pause around me, an almost imperceptible hitch in the rhythm of conversation as I placed the first envelope beside my best friend's dessert plate with the same casual grace one might use to lay down a napkin. She glanced at it, puzzled, and before she could ask, I offered a soft smile and moved to the next guest, repeating the gesture until each place at the table bore its own small white packet of quiet devastation. The murmurs began slowly, rippling through the room like the first breeze before a storm, and I sensed rather than heard the shift in energy as people exchanged curious glances, fingers tracing the edges of their envelopes while waiting for some polite cue to open them. He watched me from the head of the table, confusion flickering across his carefully composed face, and I savored the rare sight of him off balance, the man who always had a quip or a plan suddenly reduced to silent calculation. When the last envelope was delivered, I returned to my seat and raised my glass in a toast, my voice calm and steady as I thanked everyone for coming to celebrate not just his promotion, but the truth of what we build together and the honesty we deserve from those we love. A nervous laugh rippled through the guests, half amusement, half uncertainty, and with that, I gestured for them to open their envelopes. The sound of paper tearing filled the room, sharp and brittle against the soft background music, followed by the collective intake of breath as photographs and screenshots slid into view. My best friend gasped first, the sound slicing through the air like glass breaking, and then came the quiet exclamations, the whispered, "Oh my God," that spread around the table like a contagion. Faces turned toward him, eyes wide with disbelief, and for a heartbeat, the only sound was the clink of a fork dropped onto a plate. He opened his own envelope last, his fingers slow and deliberate, as if dragging out the inevitable, and when he finally saw photographs, him and the other woman outside Ember and Ash, the intimate emails, the hotel confirmations, his carefully groomed expression cracked into something raw and unguarded. "This isn't," he began, but the chorus of evidence spoke louder than any denial he could summon. I watched him struggle, his mouth opening and closing as he reached for excuses that dissolved under the weight of undeniable proof. And for the first time in years, I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated power. Friends who had once praised our relationship now sat in stunned silence, their admiration collapsing into a mix of pity and anger. And though a part of me mourned the destruction of the image we had built, a larger part relished the clarity of the moment. He tried to speak again, something about misunderstandings, about work dinners and innocent gestures, but each word landed with a dull thud of futility, and as the evidence passed from hand to hand, the room seemed to close in on him like a tightening vice. Someone asked the name of the woman in the photos. Someone else demanded how long it had been going on. Another friend, usually mild to the point of invisibility, muttered a sharp curse under her breath. I remained silent through it all, letting the proof speak for me, sipping my wine as if this were any other dinner party and not the carefully staged unraveling of a life. The music continued to play softly in the background, a mellow indie track that now felt cruelly ironic, and I found myself noting the absurd details. The way the candlelight flickered across the silverware, the faint scent of rosemary still clinging to the air, as if I were an observer rather than the architect of this quiet catastrophe. When he finally turned to me, eyes wide and pleading, I met his gaze with a calm that surprised even me. There was no satisfaction in his humiliation, not exactly. What I felt was deeper, a cold certainty that I had reclaimed something he thought he could take without consequence. "Why?" he managed at last, his voice cracking on the single word, and I tilted my head slightly, considering the question as if it required thought. "Because," I said softly, "truth deserves an audience." The silence that followed was heavy enough to bend the air, broken only by the shifting of chairs as one by one our friends pushed back from the table, some offering me quiet squeezes of support, others leaving without a word, their faces etched with the complicated blend of betrayal and pity that comes from realizing the love story they envied was nothing more than a carefully painted facade. He remained seated, staring at the photographs as if sheer will might erase them, and I stood slowly, smoothing the skirt of my dress with a steadiness that felt almost ceremonial. The night outside pressed dark against the windows, and for a fleeting second, I wondered if the neighbors could feel the aftershocks of what had just taken place, if the world beyond our apartment sensed the small but seismic shift in the air. When the last of our friends had drifted out into the night, their hurried footsteps fading down the hallway like echoes of a life already receding, the apartment fell into a silence so complete it seemed to hum against my skin. The candles guttered in their holders, casting long, unsteady shadows across the table where the wreckage of the evening remained. A smear of chocolate on an untouched dessert plate, half-empty wine glasses tipped at careless angles, envelopes scattered like the aftermath of a storm that had swept through and left nothing standing. He sat slumped at the head of the table, shoulders caved inward, the crisp white shirt now creased and stained with a splash of red wine that looked almost like blood in the low light. For a long while, neither of us spoke. I stood at the far end of the room, watching him with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a specimen that had finally revealed its true nature. And I realized that the anger I had carried like a burning coal for days had cooled into something harder and more enduring, a clean, sharp clarity. I no longer wanted to shout or demand explanations. There was nothing he could say that would reshape the truth or restore the trust he had so carelessly shattered. Eventually, he raised his head, eyes glassy, and the words came in a hoarse whisper. Apologies, half-formed excuses, the familiar litany of a man scrambling to patch a sinking ship. He spoke of loneliness, of stress at work, of meaningless mistakes, each syllable sliding across the table like water over stone, and I felt nothing but the faint sting of wasted years. I let him talk until the words collapsed under their own weight, and the silence returned, heavy and unyielding. Then I walked to the console table and picked up the final envelope, the one I had kept back from the others. Heavier than the rest, because it contained not just evidence, but the key to the life we had built together. Inside was the document I had spent the last 3 days preparing, the withdrawal slip for our joint savings account, the signed notice to our landlord ending the lease, the printed itinerary for the solo trip I had booked with the money he thought was still safely tucked away for our future. His eyes followed the envelope as I set it gently in front of him, and for the first time that evening, I saw true fear flicker behind the glassy surface of his gaze. "What is this?" he asked, his voice barely audible, and I answered with the same quiet certainty that had carried me through every step of this night. "It's everything you no longer have a claim to." He reached for the papers with a trembling hand, scanning the signatures, the withdrawal amount, the date of departure, and I watched the realization bloom across his face. The recognition that the account he had treated as a shared dream was now my escape route, that the lease termination meant the home he had taken for granted would soon be gone, that the woman who once waited for his late-night texts was already halfway out the door. A bitter laugh escaped him, short and sharp, and for a moment he seemed about to argue, to beg, but the sight of my calm expression silenced him. I told him I would be gone by morning, that my belongings were already packed in the spare bedroom, that he had 1 week to remove his things before the landlord changed the locks. Each statement landed with the finality of a judge's gavel, and with each one I felt a strange lightness spread through me, a weight lifting as if I were shedding not just the relationship, but the version of myself that had tolerated his quiet betrayals for far too long. He tried once more to speak, my name, a plea, a promise, but I held up a hand and the words died in his throat. "Don't," I said, my voice steady and low. "You had your chance to tell the truth. Tonight was mine." The clock on the wall ticked softly, marking the minutes of a life already ending, and I turned away from the table, from the man who had once been my future, and walked toward the door. The air outside was cool and sharp, carrying the faint scent of rain, and as I stepped into the quiet street, I felt the first breath of freedom fill my lungs like a promise. Behind me, the apartment stood silent, a monument to everything we had built and everything I had just dismantled. And for the first time in years, I felt the solid ground of my own power beneath my feet. I did not look back.